My husband left a voice message saying he'd find someone better. He had no idea I would find something better too. Welcome back, and enjoy what might be the best story you'll watch today. The fluorescent lights of Parker's Market buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting their harsh white glow across the endless parade of customers who moved through the aisles with the purposeful determination of people who had places to go and lives to live. Becky's fingers moved mechanically across the barcode scanner, each electronic beep serving as a metronome, marking another moment of her 41 years spent behind this same register, in this same checkout lane, wearing the same red polyester vest that had become as much a part of her identity as her own skin. The vest clung uncomfortably to her shoulders, faded from countless industrial washes that had stripped away not just the vibrant color, but somehow the dignity as well. It bore the ghostly outlines of name tags long since replaced, small rectangular shadows that told the story of promotions that never came, of recognition that remained perpetually just out of reach. Her wedding ring caught the fluorescent light as she reached for another item, a simple gold band that had once symbolized forever, but now felt more like a shackle, binding her to promises that apparently only she had intended to keep. The woman standing before her struggled with two screaming toddlers, their voices cutting through the ambient noise of shopping carts rattling across linoleum floors, and the distant conversations of people discussing dinner plans and weekend activities. The children's faces were red with the particular fury that only comes from being dragged through adult errands when they'd rather be anywhere else, their small fists pounding against the sides of their mother's cart in protest against a world they had no power to change. Becky offered the harried mother a sympathetic smile, the kind that came naturally after 18 years of customer service, when every human emotion had to be processed through the filter of professional courtesy. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of stress in her customers' faces, tight lines around the eyes that spoke of financial worry, the distracted glances at phones that suggested family crises waiting at home, the forced cheerfulness that masked deeper struggles with depression or anxiety, or the simple exhaustion of trying to hold everything together when the universe seemed determined to pull it all apart. Her earbuds sat snugly in her ears, a small rebellion against the corporate policy that discouraged personal electronics during work hours. Most managers looked the other way as long as she remained efficient and pleasant, understanding that minimum wage jobs required whatever small comforts could be carved out within the rigid structure of retail employment. The music usually helped the hours pass more quickly, provided a soundtrack to the monotony that made each shift feel less like a prison sentence and more like a meditation. But today, instead of music, her phone delivered a message that would shatter her world into irreparable pieces, transforming her mundane Tuesday afternoon into the moment when everything she thought she knew about her life revealed itself to be an elaborate illusion. "I'm going to find something better." Ryan's voice carried through the wireless signal with devastating clarity, each word precisely enunciated in the tone he used when discussing business matters or explaining complex financial concepts to people he considered intellectually inferior. There was no emotion in his delivery, no suggestion that he was discussing the dissolution of a 12-year marriage rather than commenting on the weather or critiquing a restaurant meal. "I need someone who matches my future. I'm going to find something better." The words hung in the digital space between them, traveling through cell towers and satellite networks to deliver devastation with clinical precision. Not even the dignity of a face-to-face conversation, not even the courtesy of waiting until she came home from work, until they were in private, until she could process this earth-shattering announcement without the added humiliation of having strangers witness her destruction. A voice message, delivered while she stood in her workplace, surrounded by customers who had their own problems to worry about, wearing the uniform that had become her second skin, scanning groceries for people who saw her as nothing more than a necessary step between them and their dinner preparations. Becky's hand froze mid-scan, the barcode reader still clutched in her trembling fingers, while the milk carton she'd been processing seemed to blur before her eyes as the reality of what she just heard began to sink in. The scanner's red laser continued to sweep back and forth across the product, searching for the pattern that would translate into a price, but her fingers had gone numb and unresponsive, as if her nervous system had simply decided to shut down rather than continue participating in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. She rewound the message once, her thumb fumbling with the phone's controls while her other hand maintained its grip on the scanner. Surely she'd misheard something. Surely Ryan, who could be thoughtless and self-centered, but had never been deliberately cruel, hadn't actually ended their marriage via voicemail while she was at work. But the replay confirmed every devastating word. She tried again, and then a third time, hoping somehow the digital recording would change, that reality would reassert itself and reveal this to be some kind of technical error or elaborate prank. But each repetition only hammered home the brutal truth. The man she'd loved, supported, and sacrificed for had discarded her with the same casual indifference he might show when deleting unwanted emails or throwing away yesterday's newspaper. The line behind her grew restless. A man in an expensive business suit checked his Rolex with the impatient gesture of someone accustomed to having his time valued above all other considerations. A teenager with purple hair and multiple facial piercings tapped her foot to music only she could hear, her eyes fixed on a smartphone screen that displayed whatever social media drama currently commanded her attention. An elderly woman clutched her purse with arthritic fingers, her face bearing the patient resignation of someone who'd learned that complaining about delays only made them feel longer. Life continued its relentless march forward, while Becky's universe collapsed inward, creating a singularity of pain right there in aisle 7, between the breakfast cereals and the cleaning supplies, where the industrial carpet bore the stains of the styes. Countless spilled drinks and the fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. Something cracked wide open in her chestnut, her heart, for that implied something clean and sharp, like glass breaking in a single decisive moment. This was messier, rawer, like the sound of old wood splintering under too much weight, the groaning protest of structural beams that had been bearing more than they were designed to handle for far too long. She'd been carrying that weight for years without even realizing it, and now the entire architecture of her life was giving way all at once. "Ma'am?" The business suit man's voice carried the particular kind of irritation reserved for service workers, who had the audacity to experience human emotions during business hours. "Is there a problem?" Becky looked up at him, this stranger whose biggest concern was whether his grocery shopping would make him late for whatever important meeting or social engagement awaited him. She wanted to explain that her husband had just abandoned her via voicemail, that 12 years of marriage had been dismissed in 30 seconds of recorded audio, that she was currently discovering the exact moment when everything she believed about her life revealed itself to be a lie. Instead, she managed a weak smile and resumed scanning his items: organic vegetables that cost more than she spent on food in a week, imported cheese that probably represented half her daily wage, wine that she'd never be able to afford even for special occasions. Each beep of the scanner felt like a small death, another reminder of the vast gulf between her circumstances and those of the people she served. The rest of her shift passed in a haze of mechanical motions and forced pleasantries. She scanned barcodes, counted change, bagged groceries, and wished customers a pleasant day, while her mind replayed Ryan's message on an endless loop. The words became a mantra of rejection, a meditation on inadequacy that accompanied every mundane task she performed. "I'm going to find something better." Beep. "Another can of soup for someone else's dinner." "I need someone who matches my future." Beep. "Another bottle of wine for someone else's celebration." "I'm going to find something better." Beep. "Another package of meat for someone else's family barbecue." The drive home took her through neighborhoods where she'd imagined living someday, past houses with manicured lawns and two-car garages and windows that glowed with warm yellow light, suggesting the kind of domestic contentment she'd always assumed would eventually be hers. Every landmark along the familiar route, the coffee shop where she and Ryan had their first date, nervously sharing a piece of chocolate cake while trying to impress each other with stories about their college experiences. The park where they'd walk, Max on Sunday mornings, throwing tennis balls and pretending to be the kind of couple who had everything figured out. The restaurant where he'd proposed 7 years ago, getting down on one knee beside a table decorated with roses he'd somehow arranged to have waiting for them, now served as monuments to a life that had apparently been built on foundations of sand. Each memory felt contaminated now, poisoned by the knowledge that while she'd been treasuring these moments as evidence of their love's strength and permanence, Ryan had apparently been cataloging her inadequacies and planning his escape. How long had he been thinking about leaving? How many of their conversations had been his way of gathering ammunition for the eventual divorce proceedings? How many times had he looked at her, and seen not the woman he'd promised to love forever, but an obstacle to the upgraded life he felt he deserved. Rebecca Ann Morrison had grown up in a working-class family that believed in the power of persistence, in the idea that good things came to those who were willing to work hard and wait patiently for their rewards. Her mother had drilled into her the virtues of loyalty and commitment, the importance of standing by your promises no matter how difficult circumstances became. Marriage isn't about finding someone perfect, her mother used to say while folding laundry in their small kitchen, the smell of detergent and fabric softener creating an olfactory backdrop to life lessons that seemed profound at the time. It's about choosing someone and then working together to build something beautiful. She'd carried those lessons into her relationship with Ryan, through his increasingly frequent complaints about their modest lifestyle, his pointed comments about her appearance that always began with, "I'm not trying to be mean, but," "I'm not trying to be mean, but," and ended with suggestions for improvements she couldn't afford to make. She'd endured his growing obsession with status and appearances, his way of introducing her to his colleagues that somehow managed to emphasize her job at the grocery store while downplaying the fact that she'd been supporting their household just as much as he had. Ryan worked in finance, a fact he mentioned with the regularity of a man checking his pulse, as if his professional identity required constant confirmation to remain valid. His salary significantly exceeded hers, a disparity he referenced almost daily, not with pride in his success, but with a sort of weary disappointment, as if her inability to match his earnings was a personal failing rather than a simple economic reality shaped by educational opportunities and career choices made years before they'd even met. He spoke often about the promotions he deserved, the recognition that eluded him despite his obvious qualifications, the way their modest suburban home and her practical Honda Civic somehow reflected poorly on his professional image. When clients come to the house, he'd say, surveying their living room with the critical eye of someone evaluating a property for purchase, they need to see success. They need to trust that I know how to handle money because I obviously know how to make it. Despite earning significantly more than she did, Ryan had never been inclined to share his financial success in ways that might have improved their joint circumstances. "You've got your paycheck," he'd say whenever she suggested they might pool their resources for a vacation or a home improvement project, or even something as simple as dinner at a restaurant that didn't feature a dollar menu. Use that. And she had, stretching her grocery store wages to cover half the bills, all the food shopping, and whatever household needs arose that fell outside Ryan's definition of his financial responsibilities. She'd learned to be creative with coupons and store sales, to plan meals around whatever protein happened to be marked down for quick sale, to repair clothes and appliances rather than replacing them when newer models might have been more convenient. She'd even contributed to the down payment on their house, dipping into savings she'd accumulated since her 20th birthday, money saved quarter by quarter during lean years when every dollar mattered and entertainment meant checking books out of the library rather than going to movies. That contribution had been presented as a romantic gesture, a symbol of their partnership and shared commitment to building a future together. Now she realized it had simply been another way for Ryan to leverage her resources while maintaining complete control over his own. He'd always had nicer thin-tailored suits from department stores she'd never shopped in, purchased during lunch breaks from a job that paid enough to make such indulgences feel routine rather than special. His car was a luxury sedan with leather seats and a premium sound system, while she nursed her aging Honda through another year of inspections and repair bills that always seemed to come at the worst possible moments. His phone was always the latest model, replaced annually whether the previous version still functioned or not. His laptop was sleek and powerful, capable of handling whatever demanding software his work required. His clothes came from stores with names she recognized from magazine advertisements, while hers came from discount retailers and clearance racks. She'd told herself this disparity was normal, that perhaps one day, her faithfulness and sacrifice would be rewarded with inclusion in the prosperity she'd helped make possible. She'd imagined that once Ryan felt more secure in his career, once he received the promotion he'd been expecting for 3 years, once they'd paid down enough of the mortgage to free up some monthly income, he'd naturally want to share more of his success with the woman who'd been supporting him all along. The house stood silent when she arrived, but it was a different kind of silence than she'd grown accustomed to over 12 years of marriage. This wasn't the quiet of an empty home waiting to be filled with conversation and laughter, and the comfortable sounds of two people sharing space. This was the hollowness of a space that had been deliberately emptied, systematically stripped of everything that made it feel like a home, rather than just a building with rooms and walls and fixtures. The front door opened normally, her key turning in the lock with the same small clicking sound she'd heard thousands of times before. But the moment she stepped inside, she knew something fundamental had changed. The air felt different, thinner somehow, as if someone had opened all the windows and let the essence of their shared life escape into the atmosphere. The leather sectional they'd saved for over 2 years gone. She could see the indentations in the carpet where its legs had rested, small depressions that marked the ghost of furniture they'd chosen together during a weekend shopping trip that had felt like such an adult milestone. They'd sat on dozens of couches in the showroom, testing firmness and discussing color options like the decision actually mattered, like they were building something permanent together. The dining room set her parents had given them as a wedding gift vanished completely. The mahogany table where they'd eaten Christmas dinners and celebrated birthdays, where she'd paid bills and he'd worked on his laptop during evenings when the office followed him home, now existed only as a slightly lighter rectangle on the hardwood floor where years of sunlight hadn't been able to reach. Even the coffee table she'd refinished herself during a long weekend project had disappeared. She'd spent hours sanding away years of wear and water stains, revealing the beautiful wood grain beneath layers of neglect. She'd researched the proper techniques, bought the right supplies, worked until her arms ached, and her back protested from bending over for hours at a time. When she'd finally applied the final coat of polyurethane and stepped back to admire her work, Ryan had nodded approvingly and said it looked almost professional. The walls bore pale rectangles, where pictures had hung photographs from their honeymoon, framed prints they'd bought at art fairs, even the silly snapshot of them at a Halloween party 3 years ago, when they dressed as a matching pair of playing cards. These ghostly marks served as an inventory of shared memories that had apparently meant more to her than to him, evidence of a life together that he'd been able to discard as easily as outdated calendar pages. In the bedroom, Ryan's walk-in closet yawned empty, the wooden hanger swaying slightly in the current from the air conditioning vent, like the remnants of a forest after a wildfire had swept through and consumed everything combustible. The built-in shelving that had once held his shoes and accessories now displayed only dust outlines, and the occasional forgotten sock or tie clip that hadn't been deemed worthy of inclusion in his new life. Her own clothes seemed lost and lonely on their side of the shared space, a visual representation of how she'd felt for months without consciously acknowledging it. Dresses hung with extra space between them now that his suits no longer pressed against them. Her shoes looked scattered and insufficient on shelves that had once been perfectly organized to accommodate two people's footwear collections. The dresser drawers hung open, their contents ransacked and abandoned with the haste of someone who'd wanted to complete an unpleasant task as quickly as possible. His cologne bottles and grooming supplies had disappeared completely, leaving only the faint scent of his presence slowly fading into memory, mixing with the smell of furniture polish and the lavender sachets she'd tucked into corners to keep their clothes smelling fresh. The savings account, their joint account that she'd foolishly trusted him to manage, because he was better with numbers and understood investment strategies she'd never had the education to master, had been drained to the last dollar. Years of her careful contributions, every $20 and $50 bill she'd managed to squirrel away from her modest paychecks, all gone. The online banking statement showed a balance of $0.00, with a final withdrawal that had cleared that morning while she was scanning groceries and smiling at customers who were planning dinners she could no longer afford to cook. Even Max was gone, their golden retriever, who'd been her constant companion through long shifts and difficult days, who'd greeted her at the door every evening with the kind of unconditional enthusiasm that made minimum wage work feel bearable, had been taken along with everything else Ryan had decided belonged to him. She found Max's leash hanging forgotten on the kitchen hook, a detail so small yet so devastating that it finally broke through her shock and brought the tears she'd been holding back since that first replay of the voicemail. The leash was red nylon with reflective stitching, chosen specifically for their evening walks through the neighborhood, when visibility mattered for safety. Max had learned to recognize the sound of her taking it down from its hook, the small metallic clink of the clasp that meant adventure was imminent. He'd dance around her feet while she attached it to his collar, his tail creating a percussion rhythm against furniture and walls, his joy so pure and simple that it had never failed to lift her spirits even on the worst days. Now the leash hung limp and purposeless, a reminder of companionship that had been severed as cleanly as everything else in her life. Ryan had taken Max not because he particularly enjoyed dog ownership. She'd been the one who fed him, walked him, cleaned up after him, and arranged for veterinary care, but because Max was an asset with monetary value, something that could be claimed and possessed and removed from her reach. She collapsed on the living room floor, the carpet rough against her palms, as she struggled to process the magnitude of her abandonment. The house felt impossibly large around her, every room echoing with the absence of a life she'd thought was permanent. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, its motor the only sound in a space that had been stripped of its soul, its purpose, its reason for existing. The carpet showed indentations where furniture had rested for years, small archaeological evidence of a domestic life that had apparently been more fragile than she'd ever imagined. She traced one of these depressions with her finger, remembering how they'd argued about furniture placement when they'd first moved in. She'd wanted the couch facing the window so they could watch the seasons change in their backyard. He'd preferred it facing the television so they could watch the financial news while eating breakfast. They'd compromised, as married couples do, rotating the arrangement every few months until they'd found a configuration that satisfied both their preferences. Now she realized that every compromise she'd made had been a small surrender, every accommodation a step toward the moment when she'd wake up to discover that the person she'd been adjusting herself to please had decided she was still insufficient for his needs. That night, hunger drove her to the kitchen, where she discovered the final insult: 1 egg, half a bottle of ketchup, and a slice of stale bread. This was her inheritance from 12 years of marriage, the scraps left behind by a man who'd taken everything he deemed valuable and left her with the remnants. The refrigerator, which had once been filled with the ingredients for the meals she'd planned and prepared for 2 people, now looked like the appliance of someone who'd given up on the basic act of nourishing herself. The shelves were bare, except for condiments, and the kinds of items that never seemed to get used: a pickle relish, soy sauce packets from Chinese takeout, a jar of maraschino cherries that had been there so long she couldn't remember what she'd originally intended to use them for. She cracked the egg into a pan that had seen better days, its non-stick coating worn away in patches that made cooking a small act of faith that the food wouldn't stick and burn. The egg sizzled in oil she'd found in a cabinet, probably older than it should have been, but still capable of preventing complete culinary disaster. She ate her meager dinner standing at the counter, too drained to sit at the kitchen table, where she and Ryan had shared thousands of meals, too numb to cry over the irony that she who had fed others for so many years now found herself with barely years now found herself enough food to sustain herself. The egg was overcooked, the yolk hard and dry, but it filled the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, even as it did nothing for the hollow ache in her chest. Outside her kitchen window, the neighborhood continued its evening routine, dogs barking as their owners returned from work, children playing in backyards while parents prepared dinners on grills and stovetops, families gathering around tables laden with abundance she could no longer afford. The sounds of normal life drifted through the glass, reminding her that somewhere, people were still living the kind of existence she'd once taken for granted. Sleep came fitfully that night on the bare mattress Ryan had apparently deemed unworthy of theft. The bed frame remained, but the expensive memory foam mattress that had been his contribution to their bedroom comfort had vanished along with everything else. She was left with the basic box spring and the thin backup mattress they'd kept in the guest room, a surface designed for occasional use rather than nightly rest. She curled into herself beneath a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender fabric softener, pulling her knees to her chest in the fetal position that humans instinctively adopt when the world becomes too overwhelming to face in an upright posture. Every sound in the settling house made her jump. Was he coming back? Had he forgotten something else he wanted to claim as his own? Would she wake up to find him in the bedroom, packing whatever remaining items he'd overlooked during his systematic dismantling of their shared life? But Ryan didn't return, and as the hours passed in the darkness, Becky began to understand with crystalline clarity that he never would. The voice message had been his goodbye, his dismissal, his final judgment on a woman he'd decided was insufficient for the future he envisioned for himself. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no opportunity for her to ask the questions that burned in her throat, no chance to understand how 12 years of what she'd thought was love had been reduced to 30 seconds of recorded rejection. 2 days after Ryan's departure, when she'd begun to adjust to the hollow echo of her own footsteps in a house designed for 2 people, the phone rang with news that sent her world spinning further into chaos. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and utterly without sympathy. A bank representative calling about the mortgage payment that was apparently now 3 months overdue. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Jennifer Walsh from First National Bank," the woman said, her tone suggesting this was merely another item to check off her daily list of unpleasant conversations with delinquent borrowers. "We've been trying to reach you regarding your mortgage account. According to our records, payments stopped in January, and we need to discuss your options immediately." Becky stared at the phone, certain there had been some mistake. Ryan handled their finances with the methodical precision he brought to his professional work, managing their accounts and investments, while she focused on what he called the day-to-day stuff: groceries, utilities, the mundane expenses that kept their household functioning but didn't require the sophisticated financial knowledge he'd acquired through his education and career experience. She trusted him completely, never questioning the division of labor that left her responsible for immediate necessities while he managed their long-term financial security. It had seemed like a reasonable arrangement, playing to their respective strengths and avoiding the kind of money-related arguments that she'd seen destroy other marriages. "There must be some confusion," she said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears, higher and more desperate than she'd intended. "My husband handles our mortgage payments. He sets up automatic transfers from our account every month. According to our records, Mr. Morrison contacted us 3 months ago to remove his automatic payment authorization," Jennifer Walsh continued, her voice remaining neutral but somehow conveying the implied criticism that had become familiar to anyone who'd ever fallen behind on financial obligations. "He indicated that you would be taking over responsibility for the account going forward." The words hit Becky like physical blows, each piece of information landing with devastating precision. Ryan had been planning his departure for months, systematically removing himself from their financial obligations while allowing her to remain ignorant of the approaching disaster. What kind of wife didn't know her own husband had stopped paying their mortgage? What kind of adult allowed someone else to manage such fundamental aspects of their financial life without maintaining any oversight or involvement? I don't understand," she stammered, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs that Ryan had deemed unworthy of relocation. "I wasn't told about any changes to our account." "That's correct," the bank representative confirmed with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation countless times before. "Mr. Morrison is the primary account holder, which means he has the authority to make changes without requiring your signature or consent. However, since you're listed as residing at the property, we're required to notify you of any pending legal action." She'd become the victim of laws designed to protect property rights and loan security, regulations that prioritize the bank's interests over the human casualties created when marriages dissolved and financial responsibilities shifted without warning. The conversation continued for several more excruciating minutes, during which Becky learned that not only had Ryan stopped making payments, but he'd also withdrawn the emergency fund they'd maintained for exactly these kinds of situations. His name was primary on everything: the mortgage, the savings account, even the home insurance policy that would become void if the house went into foreclosure. She was listed as a secondary party on some documents, a designation that offered her rights to nothing and responsibility for everything. She could be held liable for the debt, even though she had no access to the funds needed to satisfy it, could be pursued by collection agencies, even though she had no legal claim to the assets that's securing the loan. "We'll need to see some kind of payment within the next 10 days, Jennifer Walsh continued, consulting whatever computer screen contained the details of Becky's financial destruction, "or we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings. The amount due, including late fees and penalties, is $18,437. $18,000. More than Becky's entire annual salary after taxes, more money than she'd ever had access to at one time in her adult life. The number hung in the air like a mathematical impossibility, a figure so far beyond her means that it might as well have been 18 million. She could work every available shift at Parker's Market for the next 2 years and still not accumulate enough money to satisfy this debt, even if she somehow managed to eliminate every other expense from her budget. "Is there any kind of payment plan available?" she asked, knowing the answer but hoping that desperation might somehow create options that logic suggested didn't exist. Some way to spread the payments out over time? Unfortunately, Mrs. Morrison, payment plans are only available for borrowers who are current on their accounts, the bank representative explained, with the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news as a routine part of her job. Once an account falls this far behind, our only options are full payment or foreclosure proceedings. The word foreclosure carried weight that went beyond its literal meaning. It implied failure, irresponsibility, the kind of financial mismanagement that responsible adults were supposed to avoid through careful planning and prudent choices. It suggested that Becky had somehow been complicit in her own destruction, that her current circumstances resulted from personal failings rather than systematic betrayal by someone she'd trusted with her future. After she hung up the phone, Becky sat in her empty kitchen and tried to calculate whether $18,000 was an achievable goal under any conceivable circumstances. If she could find another job immediately, if she could work 80 hours a week, if she could eliminate every expense beyond basic survival needs, if she could somehow live on nothing but the cheapest possible food and forfeit every small comfort, that made minimum wage work bearable. Even then, the mathematics of poverty made the bank's demands impossible to satisfy. A week later, as if the universe had decided her suffering wasn't quite complete enough to satisfy whatever cosmic sense of justice governed such things, an official-looking envelope appeared in her mailbox bearing the seal of the county court. The envelope felt heavy with legal authority, its contents dense with the kind of formal language that transformed human disasters into administrative procedures. Inside, documents printed on expensive paper and written in deliberately intimidating legal terminology informed her that she had 30 days to vacate the premises or face forced removal by law enforcement officials. The language was precise and impersonal, reducing her 12-year residence to a simple matter of property law and contractual obligations. Eviction. The word itself felt shameful, carrying connotations of failure and irresponsibility that Becky had never associated with her own life. She'd always paid her bills, met her obligations, lived within her means with the careful attention to detail that people of limited resources learn to exercise as a matter of survival. Yet here she was, facing homelessness through no fault of her own, victim of laws that protected financial institutions while leaving individuals vulnerable to the calculating cruelty of people they trusted with their hearts. She read the documents 3 times, hoping to find some loophole, some avenue of appeal, some way to prove that this was all a terrible mistake that could be corrected through proper explanation. But the law was clear and unforgiving. When your name isn't on the deed and you can't make the payments, your residency becomes a privilege that can be revoked with proper legal notice and sufficient time for you to arrange alternative housing. The 30-day notice period was presented as a courtesy, evidence of a legal system that balanced the rights of property owners against the basic human need for shelter. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," Margaret continued, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd delivered this speech too many times over the years, who'd watched the grocery industry's relentless pursuit of profit margins transform steady employment into an increasingly precarious proposition for workers at every level. "We're downsizing," she announced, without additional preamble, understanding that prolonging the suspense would only make an already painful conversation more difficult for both of them. "Corporate has decided to eliminate several full-time positions across all locations as part of a chain-wide cost reduction initiative. Since you've been here the longest, your severance package will be more substantial than what newer employees receive. But I'm afraid your position is being eliminated effective immediately." The words hit Becky like physical blows, each one landing with devastating precision in the space between her ribs, where her heart had already been bruised by too much recent trauma. 18 years of loyal service, of showing up early and staying late, of covering shifts for sick colleagues, and working through holidays, when other people were home with their families, of maintaining a professional demeanor, even when customers treated her with casual contempt. Of it reduced to a corporate decision made by people in offices hundreds of miles away who'd never learned her name or witnessed her dedication. "Your final paycheck will include 2 weeks severance pay," Margaret continued, sliding an envelope across the desk with the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed this ritual too many times to find it emotionally engaging anymore. "I want you to know that this decision came from levels far above my authority. If it were up to me, if I had any choice in the matter, you'd be the last person I'd ever consider letting go. 2 weeks' pay. $468 after taxes, barely enough to buy groceries for a month under normal circumstances, let alone enough to secure new housing and survive until she could find another job in an economy where employers increasingly preferred younger workers who would accept lower workers' wages and demand fewer benefits. Becky took the envelope with hands that had somehow stopped shaking, her body's shock response finally exhausted by the relentless succession of disasters that had transformed her life from stable routine into chaotic freefall. The envelope felt thin and insubstantial, inadequate compensation for nearly 2 decades of labor, for the arthritis in her knees from standing on concrete floors, for the permanent smile lines around her eyes from maintaining cheerfulness through countless difficult interactions. She cleaned out her locker in the employee break room, gathering the few personal items she'd accumulated over nearly 2 decades of working in the same building. A photo of her and Ryan from happier times, back when his smile had seemed genuine, and happier times, back when his smile had seemed genuine. His arm around her waist had felt protective rather than possessive. A small succulent plant that had somehow survived under fluorescent lights, its thick leaves a testament to the kind of resilience she hoped she still possessed. A coffee mug with a chip in the handle that she'd grown fond of despite its imperfection, or perhaps because of it. These meager possessions fit easily into a single plastic bag, a tangible representation of how little she'd allowed herself to accumulate in a workplace where she'd spent most of her adult life. The locker itself looked strangely large once emptied, its metal walls bearing the scratches and dents that told the story of countless shift changes, of hurried preparations for work, and exhausted conclusions to long days spent on her feet. The other employees avoided eye contact as she walked through the store for the last time, their discomfort palpable in the way they suddenly found urgent tasks that required their complete attention. She represented their own vulnerability, proof that loyalty and hard work offered no protection against the arbitrary cruelties of economic reality that could transform anyone from valued employee to redundant expense with a single corporate decision. Some of these coworkers had families to support, mortgages to pay, children whose futures depended on jobs that could disappear with nothing more than a phone call from corporate headquarters. They understood, with the intuitive wisdom of people who live paycheck to paycheck, that acknowledging her situation too directly might somehow make them more susceptible to the same fate. Outside, the parking lot stretched before her like a desert of hot asphalt and abandoned shopping carts, heat waves rising from the pavement in the late afternoon sun. Her Honda Civic sat in the employee section where she'd parked it thousands of times before, faithful and unpretentious, the only thing in her life that hadn't betrayed or abandoned her when circumstances became difficult. She sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the store that had defined her identity for 18 years, wondering who she was supposed to be now that everything she'd thought permanent had proven ephemeral. The building looked the same as always, her brick facade, large windows displaying weekly specials, automatic doors that opened and closed with mechanical regularity as customers entered and exited with their purchases. But she was no longer part of that routine, no longer one of the people who made the system function. She'd been expelled from the economic ecosystem that had sustained her, cast out into a world where her experience and dedication apparently counted for nothing against the mathematics of profit margins and cost reduction initiatives. The car became her refuge when the eviction notice expired, and the sheriff's deputies arrived to oversee her removal from the house she'd called home for over a decade. They were professional but firm, explaining with the practiced sympathy of people who performed this duty regularly that she could take only what she could carry, and that any remaining possessions would be disposed of according to state law. The deputies were middle-aged men who'd probably seen every variation of human misery that resulted when financial obligations exceeded financial resources. They treated her with courtesy while maintaining the emotional distance necessary to perform a job that required them to uproot families and destroy the domestic stability that most people took for granted. She packed what fit in her car with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd never had to prioritize possessions before, choosing between items that all seemed essential until forced scarcity demanded impossible decisions. Some clothes, but not all. She kept work-appropriate outfits and weather-appropriate layers while abandoning everything else. A few books that had provided comfort during difficult times, their pages worn soft from repeated reading. The photo albums Ryan had deemed unworthy of theft, filled with images of relatives who'd passed away and friends who drifted out of contact over the years. Everything else had dishes her grandmother had given her as a wedding gift, each piece wrapped in tissue paper and presented with stories about the meals they'd served and the celebrations they'd witnessed. The furniture she'd saved for months to buy, choosing each piece carefully from thrift stores and clearance sales. The accumulated artifacts of a life lived in one place for over a decade became someone else's problem to solve. The kitchen table where she'd paid bills and planned meals, where she'd wrapped Christmas presents and helped neighborhood children with homework when their parents worked late shifts, would be loaded into a truck and hauled away to some municipal disposal facility. The rocking chair where she'd read novels on Sunday afternoons, imagining herself as the heroines who always seemed to find happiness despite overwhelming obstacles, would be broken down and recycled into materials for products she'd never be able to afford. That first night in the car, parked behind a 24-hour laundromat, where the security lights provided a measure of safety, and the constant hum of industrial washers and dryers masked the sound of her crying, Becky discovered depths of despair she hadn't known existed. The backseat of a Honda Civic wasn't designed for human habitation, and her 5'6" frame couldn't find any position that didn't result in cramped muscles and aching joints. She used her winter coat as a blanket, its down filling providing some insulation against the cool night air that seemed to seep through the car's windows and doors despite their closed positions. Her rolled-up sweater served as a pillow, though it offered little comfort against the hard plastic of the door panel and the unyielding surface of the seat cushion. The laundromat's windows glowed like beacons in the darkness, fluorescent lights creating an aquarium effect that allowed her to watch people come and go throughout, the night shift workers washing uniforms before heading home to apartments and houses she'd never see, college students doing laundry because their dormitory machines were broken or because they couldn't afford the campus facilities, elderly people who seemed to use the 24-hour business as much for social contact as for cleaning clothes. Each person who entered and left had somewhere to go afterward, somewhere that belonged to them, somewhere with doors that locked and beds that waited for their return. Becky had forfeited her membership in that basic human community, become one of the invisible people she'd passed on streets without really seeing, understanding now that homelessness wasn't a moral failing, but a circumstance that could swallow anyone whose safety net proved insufficiently strong to catch them when they fell. The nights were the worst part. During daylight hours, she could maintain the pretense of normalcy, could sit in libraries and coffee shops and blend in with people who had homes to return to when evening came. But when darkness fell and the world divided itself into those who had shelter and those who didn't, her exile from conventional society became impossible to ignore or disguise. She learned the rhythms of 24-hour businesses, discovering which gas stations had the cleanest restrooms and the most understanding staff. She found that some fast food restaurants would allow her to sit for hours nursing a cup of coffee if she chose her timing carefully and didn't attract attention to herself. She identified parking spots where a lone woman in a car wouldn't draw unwanted notice from police or predators. The days blurred together in a haze of job applications and careful resource management. She used public restrooms at gas stations and fast food restaurants, learning which locations had the cleanest facilities and the most understanding management. Some places posted signs discouraging loitering, but others seemed to recognize that people in desperate circumstances deserved basic human dignity. She discovered that libraries offered more than just free internet access. They provided private spaces where a woman could sit for hours without anyone questioning her right to be there, bathrooms with soap and paper towels, and an atmosphere of quiet respect that made her feel temporarily human again, rather than simply a problem to be managed or moved along. She applied for every position she could find that didn't require an address for contact, purpose-retail jobs that paid minimum wage, but promised immediate income, cleaning services that required no experience but offered flexible scheduling, temporary positions that provided no benefits but might lead to something more permanent if she proved herself valuable enough to retain. Her lack of a permanent address complicated every aspect of the job search process, forcing her to be creative about contact information and interview scheduling. Some employers were understanding when she explained her circumstances, while others seemed to view homelessness as evidence of character flaws that made her unsuitable for employment, regardless of her qualifications or work history. 5 nights into her automotive housing situation, when the accumulation of stress and inadequate nutrition had pushed her body beyond its ability to function normally. Becky's physical resources finally surrendered to circumstances that had been designed to break stronger people than herself. She'd been standing in line at a potential employer's office, clutching yet another application form, and trying to project the confidence and reliability that homeless people weren't supposed to possess, when the world tilted sideways and the floor rushed up to meet her with an inevitability that felt almost gentle compared to everything else that had happened recently. The last thing she remembered was a concerned voice asking if someone should call an ambulance, and then darkness claimed her with almost merciful completeness. When consciousness returned several hours later, she found herself in a hospital bed, surrounded by the antiseptic smells and steady electronic beeping that characterized medical facilities everywhere. A nurse with kind eyes and graying hair sat beside her bed, checking her chart with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen every form of human suffering and learned to treat each case with equal dignity, regardless of insurance, status, or ability to pay. Her name tag read Claire, and something in her demeanor suggested she understood that healing involved more than just medical treatment. "Hello, honey," Claire said, her voice carrying a warmth that Becky hadn't heard directed at her in weeks. "I'm Claire. You gave us quite a scare. The paramedics said you collapsed from dehydration and exhaustion. When was the last time you had a proper meal?" The question should have been simple to answer, but Becky found herself struggling to remember when she'd last eaten something that qualified as actual nutrition rather than just temporary hunger suppression. Time had become fluid since her life fell apart, days distinguished only by whether she'd managed to earn enough spare change for a dollar menu item or had been forced to go without food entirely. "I'm not sure," she admitted, the words catching in her throat as she realized how completely she'd lost track of the basic requirements for human survival. "Maybe 3 days ago. There was a sandwich from somewhere, I think." Claire's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she'd heard similar stories before. That Becky's situation wasn't unique or particularly shocking to someone who worked in an emergency room where society's failures arrive regularly for emergency treatment. "The doctor says your blood work shows severe dehydration and malnutrition. We're going to get some fluids into you and make sure you're stable before we discharge you." She adjusted something on the IV stand with the gentle competence of someone who'd performed this task thousands of times, then settled back into her chair with the unhurried manner of someone who understood that healing required time and attention rather than efficiency. "Is there someone I can call? Family member? Friend? Someone who should know you're here?" The question hung in the air between them, highlighting the completeness of Becky's isolation in ways that made her current circumstances feel even more devastating. Ryan had been her emergency contact for everything medical forms, employment paperwork, insurance documents, and his departure had left her without backup plans or support systems that most adults took for granted. Her parents had passed away years earlier, victims of the heart disease and cancer that claimed so many people of their generation before medical science could offer them better alternatives. The friendships she'd maintained had been casual workplace relationships that didn't extend to personal crises, acquaintanceships built around shared shifts and common complaints about management, rather than the deeper bonds that might survive major bonds. Life upheavals. "No," she said finally, the admission feeling like another small death. "There's no one." Claire nodded, as if she had expected this answer, as if the correlation between homelessness and social isolation was something she'd observed enough times to recognize the pattern. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a wrapped sandwich, the kind of simple meal that hospitals provided for staff during long shifts. "I used to be where you are," Claire continued, unwrapping the sandwich with deliberate care. "Different circumstances, but the same feeling of falling through cracks you didn't even know existed. The same sense that everyone else was living in a world with safety nets and support systems that somehow didn't apply to you." Something in the nurse's tone suggested this wasn't just professional sympathy, and Becky found herself paying attention in a way she hadn't been able to focus on anything for weeks. Here was someone who'd survived whatever version of catastrophe life had thrown at her, and emerged on the other side with enough compassion to sit with strangers in their darkest moments, to offer hope that felt authentic rather than patronizing. "How?" Becky asked, the word barely a whisper. How do you get out when everything you built just disappears? Claire smiled, and it was the first genuine expression of hope Becky had encountered since her world imploded. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one person willing to help at a time. She handed Becky the sandwich, its weight substantial enough to suggest real ingredients rather than processed substitutes. Start with this. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes next. The sandwich was simple peanut butter and jelly on white bread, but it tasted like salvation to someone whose body had been running on empty for days. As Becky ate, Claire told her about a church not far from the hospital that ran programs for women in crisis situations. People who'd found themselves displaced by circumstances beyond their control. I'm not particularly religious myself, Claire explained with the careful honesty of someone who'd learned to separate spiritual beliefs from practical assistance. But sometimes desperate circumstances require people to accept help from unexpected sources. The people there understand that crisis doesn't discriminate based on faith or moral worthiness. They don't preach at you, Claire assured her, recognizing the hesitation in Becky's expression. They don't require you to attend services or profess beliefs you don't hold. They just provide what you need to get back on your feet. Shelter, food, job placement assistance, and dignity. That last one might be the most important thing they offer. Dignity. The word resonated with Becky in ways she couldn't articulate, touching something deep inside her that had been damaged by weeks of feeling invisible and worthless. She'd been stripped of so many things: her home, her marriage, her job, her financial security. Perhaps most devastatingly, she'd lost her sense of herself as someone worthy of respect and consideration. The church Claire recommended sat on a quiet corner in an older part of the city, its brick facade weathered but well-maintained, surrounded by mature trees that provided welcome shade during summer heat and suggested the kind of permanence that Becky had lost faith in. A simple sign announced New Hope Community Church in letters that had faded but remained legible. And below that, in smaller text that spoke to practical rather than theological concerns. Becky hesitated at the entrance, her hand resting on the door handle while she fought the internal voices that insisted she didn't belong among people who had their lives together. She'd never been particularly religious, finding more comfort in practical action than in prayer or theological contemplation. Her recent experiences had left her questioning whether any benevolent force actually paid attention to human suffering, or intervened in the kind of disasters that seemed to strike randomly and without regard for the victim's worthiness. But Claire's sandwich had been real, and her kindness had been genuine, and sometimes faith meant trusting in human goodness rather than divine intervention. Sometimes survival required accepting help from sources you hadn't previously considered, expanding your definition of community to include people whose beliefs and backgrounds differed from your own. Becky opened the door and stepped inside, immediately struck by the warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the way space had been designed to welcome rather than intimidate. The interior was simple but comfortable, with wooden pews that showed the wear patterns of decades of use and windows that allowed natural light to supplement the gentle artificial illumination. A woman in her 60s approached with the unhurried manner of someone accustomed to meeting people in crisis, her gray hair pulled back in a practical style, and her clothing chosen for comfort rather than fashion. She introduced herself as Judy Martinez, coordinator of the church's assistance programs, and explained the services available to women who found themselves temporarily displaced. Temporarily, Judy emphasized, making eye contact in a way that suggested she understood the psychological importance of framing homelessness as a condition rather than an identity. Because that's what this is, a temporary situation that we're going to work together to resolve. The shelter program operated out of a converted house adjacent to the church building, offering private rooms for up to 8 women at a time. The accommodations were basic but clean, with shared bathroom facilities and a kitchen where residents could prepare their own meals using donated groceries and basic cooking equipment. More importantly, the program included job placement assistance, resume preparation, interview coaching, and the kind of practical support that people needed to transition from crisis back to stability. Judy explained that the average stay was 3 to 4 months, long enough for residents to save money for deposits and first month's rent on permanent housing. "We don't have a lot of rules," Judy continued, leading Becky through the facility with obvious pride in what they'd accomplished. No alcohol or drugs on the premises, no overnight guests, participation in weekly house meetings to discuss any issues that arise. Beyond that, we trust people to manage their own lives while we provide the support they need to get back on their feet. The room Becky was assigned was small but private, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto a garden where previous residents had planted flowers and vegetables. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, and someone had hung encouraging quotations in simple frames words about perseverance and hope that might have seemed trite under other circumstances, but felt profoundly meaningful to someone who'd begun to doubt whether her situation could improve. That first night in an actual bed, between clean sheets, with a locked door between herself and the outside world, Becky slept more deeply than she had in weeks. The simple luxury of horizontal rest, of physical safety, of knowing she wouldn't be woken by police flashlights, or the need to move her car before dawn, allowed her body to begin recovering from the trauma of recent events. Judy proved to be more than just an administrator. Over the following weeks, she became a mentor, teacher, and sometimes surrogate family member who understood that rebuilding a life required more than just providing shelter and meals. She helped Becky rewrite her resume to emphasize transferable skills rather than just job titles, taught her interview techniques that highlighted her reliability and experience rather than her recent employment gap. 18 years of customer service experience, Judy said, reviewing the updated resume with the attention of someone who understood that presentation mattered in ways that went beyond qualifications. That demonstrates loyalty, patience, communication skills, problem-solving ability. Any employer would be lucky to have someone with your background. She also provided something equally important to daily routine that gave structure to days that had become shapeless and directionless during the worst period of Becky's crisis. Morning coffee in the communal kitchen, job searching at the computer center the church maintained for residents, afternoon walks through the neighborhood that helped her remember what normal life looked like. The other women in the shelter became an unexpected source of strength and community. Despite coming from different backgrounds and experiencing different types of crisis, they shared an understanding of what it meant to have your life completely disrupted through circumstances largely beyond your control. There was Maria, whose husband's construction accident had left him disabled and their family unable to afford their rent. Sarah, who'd fled an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and her 2 young children. Jennifer, whose small business had failed during an economic downturn, taking her savings and her apartment with it. Each woman's story was different in its details but similar in its fundamental elements. Normal people living normal lives, until something happened that revealed how fragile their security actually was, how quickly circumstances could change from comfortable routine to desperate struggle for basic survival. They supported each other through the daily humiliations of poverty the way potential employers looked at addresses in less affluent neighborhoods. The difficulty of maintaining professional appearance when your wardrobe consisted of donated clothes. The exhaustion of being grateful for help while simultaneously resenting the circumstances that made such help necessary. After 3 weeks of systematic job searching, Becky found an opening at a local hotel chain housekeeping work that required no special training but promised steady hours and the possibility of advancement for employees who proved reliable and the possibility of advancement. Hardworking. The pay was slightly above minimum wage, enough to begin saving for the deposits and references required for independent housing. The work was physically demanding in ways that retail employment hadn't prepared her for. Where scanning groceries had required standing in one place for hours, hotel housekeeping involved constant movement, pushing heavy carts of supplies between rooms, lifting mattresses to change sheets, bending and stretching to clean bathrooms and vacuum floors. But it was honest work that served a clear purpose, and Becky approached it with the same dedication she'd brought to every job she'd ever held. Each room she cleaned represented someone's temporary home, a space where travelers rested between destinations or business meetings. She took pride in creating environments that were spotless and welcoming, understanding that her attention to detail contributed to experiences that guests would remember long after they'd moved on to their next destination. The other housekeeping staff were primarily women like herself, people who'd learned that survival sometimes required accepting whatever employment was available, regardless of whether it matched their previous experience or future aspirations. They worked efficiently and supported each other through the physical demands of the job, sharing techniques for managing heavy workloads and dealing with difficult guests. Becky discovered that she enjoyed the solitary nature of the work. The way each room presented a self-contained challenge that could be completed and marked off a list. After months of feeling helpless and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control, there was satisfaction in creating visible, immediate results through her own efforts. Every day, she scrubbed toilets, changed sheets, and cleaned up after people who rarely acknowledged her presence, who saw housekeeping staff as part of the hotel's infrastructure, rather than as individuals with their own stories and struggles. But she approached each task with pride, understanding that her work contributed to an industry that helped people travel and conduct business and maintain connections across distances. Slowly, she began saving again. $10 here, $20 there, each small amount carefully preserved in an account she'd opened at a credit union that specialized in serving people who were rebuilding their financial lives. The accumulation was painfully slow, but it represented progress toward independence that felt more meaningful than any achievement she'd experienced in years. One day, while cleaning a suite on the hotel's executive floor, a guest left behind a laptop computer, expensive, sophisticated, the kind of equipment that probably cost more than she earned in several months. According to hotel policy, lost items were supposed to be turned in to the front desk immediately, but Becky understood that many of her colleagues might be tempted to keep something so valuable, especially given their generally desperate financial circumstances. She didn't hesitate. The laptop went straight to the front desk manager, along with a detailed note about where she'd found it and what condition it had been in. To her, the choice wasn't complicated. Taking something that didn't belong to her would have violated the principles that had sustained her through the worst period of her life. The next morning, a man in his early 60s appeared at the housekeeping supervisor's office, asking specifically to speak with the employee who'd turned in his computer. He was well-dressed but approachable, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested success achieved through hard work rather than inherited privilege. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said, when Becky was called to meet with him. "Most people would have been tempted to keep it, especially given what these things cost. But you did the right thing without even hesitating." He introduced himself as Arthur Malone, and when she didn't react to the name, he explained that he owned the hotel chain where she worked, not just this location, but 37 properties across 3 states. What had seemed like a routine encounter with a grateful guest was actually a meeting with someone who had the power to change her circumstances in ways she couldn't have imagined. "Yeah, people like you," Arthur continued. "People with integrity who do the right thing even when no one's watching. Those are the employees I'm always looking for. How would you feel about leaving housekeeping and trying something in our corporate office?" The offer seemed too good to be true. The kind of miraculous reversal that happened in movies, but not in real life. Especially not to women who'd been sleeping in cars just months earlier. But Arthur explained that his company had been built on the principle that character mattered more than credentials, that employees who demonstrated honesty and reliability could be trained for positions that required technical skills. He offered her a job in the corporate training department, working with new managers to develop customer service protocols and quality standards. The position included health insurance, paid vacation time, and a salary that would allow her to afford not just basic survival, but actual comfort for the first time in her adult life. 2 years later, Becky was no longer cleaning hotel rooms or living in transitional housing. She'd been promoted to assistant manager of training and development, responsible for creating programs that helped hotel staff provide exceptional service to guests. She had a small apartment with a balcony where she grew herbs and flowers, a cat named Daisy who'd been rescued from the same shelter system that had saved her own life. Her savings account showed a balance that would have seemed impossible during her darkest moments, and her credit rating had recovered enough for her to qualify for a car loan that replaced her faithful Honda with something newer and more reliable. Most importantly, she had work that felt meaningful, that allowed her to use her experience to help other people develop skills that might protect them from the kind of economic vulnerability she'd experienced. The apartment was small, but comfortable, decorated with furniture she'd chosen herself and photographs that reminded her of how far she'd traveled from the desperate woman who'd collapsed in an unemployment office. She'd learned to cook for pleasure rather than mere survival, experimenting with recipes that transformed basic ingredients into meals that nourished both body and spirit. Evening walks through her neighborhood revealed a community of people who were building lives with the same careful attention to stability that she'd learned to prioritize. Children played in small front yards, while their parents tended gardens and discussed the kinds of everyday concern school programs, local politics, neighborhood improvements that only people with secure housing could afford to care about. Then one evening, while working late at the hotel to finish quarterly training reports, she walked into the lobby and encountered a figure from her past that she'd assumed she'd never see again. Ryan stood at the front desk with a suitcase beside him, looking tired and somehow smaller than she remembered. His expensive clothing rumpled from travel and his confident bearing replaced by the uncertainty of someone whose plans hadn't worked out as expected. He looked older, she realized, with new lines around his eyes and a softness around his midsection that suggested he'd been dealing with his own forms of stress and disappointment. The woman he'd left her for, something better. He'd been so confident he could find was nowhere to be seen, and his lone suitcase suggested he was traveling alone for reasons that probably weren't pleasant. When he saw her behind the front desk in a tailored navy suit that spoke to professional success and personal dignity, his jaw dropped in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. This wasn't the broken woman he'd abandoned via voicemail, the grocery store cashier whose limited income and uncertain prospects had made her unsuitable for the upgraded life he'd envisioned for himself. "Becky?" he stammered, his voice carrying the same tone of disbelief he might have used if he'd encountered someone he'd thought was dead. Is that really you?" She looked him in the eye with the calm, steady gaze of someone who'd learned that her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions or treatment. The fear and desperation that had characterized their last months together had been replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing she could survive whatever life chose to throw at her. "Yes," she said, her voice professional but not unkind. "How can I help you, sir?" He fumbled for words, clearly struggling to reconcile the successful professional woman before him with his memories of the person he'd discarded when her presence had become inconvenient to his ambitions. "You work here?" "I manage corporate training for this hotel chain," she replied, allowing him to process the implications of what that meant about her current circumstances. "Can I help you with your reservation?" For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked down at his shoes in the gesture of someone who'd realized that his assumptions about other people's limitations had been based more on his own prejudices than on actual assessment of their capabilities. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine shame. "I heard you lost your job," he said quietly. "At the grocery store. I'm sorry." She nodded, acknowledging both the information and the apology without allowing either to affect her emotional equilibrium. "Thank you for your concern. Is there anything specific I can help you with tonight? You look—" He paused, searching for words that might capture the transformation he was witnessing. "You look happy." "I am," she said, and realized as she spoke that it was completely true. The happiness wasn't the desperate, clingy kind that depended on other people's approval or presence. It was the solid, sustainable contentment that came from knowing she'd built something real with her own efforts, that her security didn't depend on anyone else's decisions or commitments. He didn't ask for forgiveness, perhaps understanding that some betrayals were too fundamental to be erased by simple apologies. She didn't offer it, not because she harbored active resentment, but because forgiveness wasn't something he needed from her to move forward with his own life. Some things didn't need to be spoken, didn't require dramatic confrontations or lengthy explanations. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal was simply living well, demonstrating through action rather than words that the person who'd been discarded had found ways to flourish that had nothing to do with the relationship that had ended. That night, when she went to bed in her cozy apartment with clean sheets she'd bought herself, beside a cat who purred contentedly, in a space that belonged entirely to her, she wept, not out of sadness for what she'd lost, but from gratitude for what she'd found. Because the woman no one had thought would survive had become someone no one could ignore. And if you, reading this, feel abandoned, lost, invisible, if you've been told you're not enough, or that someone else is planning to find something better, let this story remind you that your value isn't determined by other people's recognition or lack thereof. You are not done. Your story isn't over. Because sometimes the ones who are thrown away rise the highest, and sometimes I'm going to find something better becomes you. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on the same channel.